Chapter 2276. Cher didn't say anything. She just looked at him. Lan Yu's voice was hoarse. "Come back to New York with me. We'll start over." He walked over and reached out to hold her in his arms. "And I'm sorry." His face was buried in her hair. She had the fragrance of a bath, but he smelled like Yi Muyun. Cher didn't move and let him hold her. He said softly, "And I'm sorry. I won't do it again." "Don't you want revenge anymore?" Cher stood ramrod straight. "Or do you think this is the best revenge you can get?" Lan Yu closed his eyes in pain. "And don't you trust me at all?" "No." Cher reached out to push him away. "You could have never said it. Maybe we could have lived in peace forever. But you returned to be city." His voice was hoarse and angry. "If you hadn't come back, we would have been very happy." "What about Yang Yani?" Cher sneered. "What about the woman who has been with you for so many years? Where are you?" Lan Yu took 2 steps back and his eyes were deep. "I can let go of everything." "And, can you?" He said word by word, "For Ishu." Cher's heart twitched. It hurt. If it weren't for Ishu, she might have followed Yi Muyun just now. She wouldn't have come back. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. It was a silent refusal. She said slowly, "Lan Yu, I'll hold a press conference. I'll announce that our marriage is fake." Lan Yu's eyes narrowed. "For Yi Muyun?" "No, it's not." She forced a smile. "I'm not going to live in your hatred, and I also think that I'm no match for you. I won't put myself in danger and let you threaten him." When he stepped forward, she said softly, "Lan Yu, I won't give you a chance to hurt me again. This is a hospital. Think about the consequences." Her tone was very calm. "Ishu is your son. I don't think you will hurt him because of hatred." She said it very lightly, but he roughly understood what she was thinking. She was going to give up on Ishu and break up with him. Lan Yu smiled faintly. "Is that so? Are you sure?" Cher lowered her eyes. "Lan Yu, whether it's because of a conspiracy or something else, I still have to thank you." She slowly walked to Ishu's bedside and lowered her head to kiss him. "Ishu, I'm sorry." But after last night, she thought that a dysfunctional family was the greatest harm to Ishu. She pursed her lips and took a step back. "Lan Yu, it's time to end this." Her eyes were watery. "You have hatred in your heart, but you are still a very good person." Lan Yu's body trembled. When she was about to leave, he suddenly grabbed her hand and hugged her from behind. "And, haven't you thought of another possibility?" Cher's body stiffened. After a long time, she said softly, "Lan Yu, it's impossible for us to be together." She wasn't a fool. It wasn't that she didn't feel it, but she could even give up on Yi Muyun, let alone him. Chapter 2277. Lan Yu took a step back and smiled bitterly. "Fine, I'll let you go." His voice was very soft. "But I know you'll come back." Cher suddenly thought of Yang Yani's words. She said that the truth was right beside her. She said that Lan Yu held the most important thing in her life. She wanted to go to New York and ask Yang Yani about it. But before Cher could go to New York, before Guzei's men could find Yang Yani, she was already dead. Killed by a gunshot. The beautiful woman was killed in her apartment and was not discovered until 2 days later. The only person who knew Lan Yu's secret was dead. Shuai heard the news from Guzei. She sat in the cafe, listening to Guzei's words, and was lost in thought for a long time. A fatal shot. She couldn't find any evidence, but she knew that it was Lan Yu who did it. He was warning her that if she acted rashly, he would do anything. Cher knew about Yang Yani. She had been with him for so many years, he killed her when he said he would. What was Lan Ting's position in his heart? The domineering possessiveness that an older brother had towards his younger sister? She shuddered. Gu Zhe said calmly, Cher, Mr. Yi hopes that you can go back. Gu Zhe, I can't go back, Cher said calmly. Lan Yu has gone mad. He can do anything. As she said that, her hand trembled. Her cell phone rang. It was Lan Yu's phone call. Ever since Ishu went to the hospital, she had moved out of the suite and into another hotel. She picked up the phone, her body trembling. Lan Yu said calmly, Ann, Ishu misses you. Cher didn't say anything. She held the phone and waited, but he didn't hang up. After a long time, she said softly, I'll be back in a while. With that, she slowly hung up the phone. Gu Zhe grabbed her arm. Cher. You all know. Lan Yu has gone mad. Cher looked at Gu Zhe. You know Lan Ting, right? You went to study with him. You know that girl, right? Gu Zhe's lips moved slightly, and his face was a little pale. He said with difficulty, Mr. Yi has nothing to do with her. It was just a story of an ignorant little girl who was too willful, and the ending was sad. But she's dead, and you don't feel anything, do you? Cher asked softly. Gu Zhe didn't deny it. Yes, apart from Cher, Mr. Yi had a heart of stone when it came to others. Cher pursed her lips and didn't say anything. She slowly straightened her body and walked out of the cafe, faster and faster. But at the door, she bumped into Yi Muyun. It was obvious that Gu Zhe had told him she was here. They hadn't seen each other for a few days, and seeing him again felt like a lifetime had passed. I have to go back. She said softly, I'm Ishu's mother. Yang Yani was only the first. Lan Yu could do even crazier things at any time. She was starting to feel afraid. I can get him out, Yi Muyun said calmly. Cher pursed her lips. And then? Get someone to kill Lan Yu. She looked at him. Do you know that Ishu is sick? He can't bleed, and once he bleeds, he won't be able to stop it. Only Lan Yu's blood can save him. So, she had never thought of bringing Ishu with her, because that would kill Ishu. Chapter 2278. As soon as she said that, Yi Muyun's face turned extremely ugly. He stared into her eyes and asked slowly, You're saying that Lan Ishu can't stop bleeding? Cher lowered her eyes. Yes. She then looked up at him. Yi Muyun, I've let you down. Her arm was caught and his voice was extremely gloomy. What are you going to do? Sacrifice yourself and be with Lan Yu, huh? I don't know, but I can't let Ishu be alone with him. Cher's voice was a little choked up. Yi Muyun's eyes were burning and his heart was boiling. The only thing he could be sure of was that the little idiot in front of him didn't know anything. He had been sick before he was 10 years old and his blood had been flowing non-stop. She was still a little girl, and he didn't mention it when he grew up. She had long forgotten about it. Now that Xiao Yishu had the same illness as him, she naturally didn't suspect anything. But, he frowned and pulled her in, lowering his head to look at her. Have you ever thought about why you're so concerned about Lan Yu's son? Her lips moved slightly. You know, he's not my son. Idiot. He closed his eyes. She didn't even know if she had given birth to a child. However, he immediately recalled that there were indeed no marks on her body at that time. She had indeed not given birth to a child. So, how did she give birth to this 5-year-old child? Yi Muyun looked at her for a long time before saying indifferently, All right, I'll let you go. He slowly let go of her arm and let her disappear in front of him. But no one had expected that this short separation in his heart would turn into a long one. After Cher left, Yi Muyun turned sideways and Gu Zhe was right behind him. Mr. Yi. Gu Zhe's tone was indifferent. Yi Muyun said softly, seal all the airports, don't let Lan Yu leave the country. He guessed that Lan Yu was using Ishu to force Cher to go back to New York with him. Cher was right. This man was crazy. Gu Zhe hesitated for a moment. What about this side? I will follow immediately. Send a few dozen people with me. As Yi Muyun spoke, he walked to the front of the car, opened the door, and got in. When he got into the car, his eyebrows suddenly twitched, as if foreshadowing that something bad was about to happen. He started to regret letting Cher go. He should have gone there himself. At that time, he was probably there for Ishu, the little fellow who was likely to be his son. Yi Muyun frowned and started the car. The sports car with good performance instantly sped up and drove toward the GM hotel. In less than 10 minutes, his car arrived at the entrance of the hotel. There was a car accident at the entrance of the hotel. One of the cars was Cher's white Porsche. When Yi Muyun's car stopped, his entire head was filled with blood. He couldn't believe that something had happened to Cher in such a short time. His throat felt like it was blocked. All the guilt he felt could not buy time, could not make him make a wrong decision. The two sports cars, one red and one white, collided head to head. Especially the red sports car. Half of the front of the car was smashed. The police suddenly began to evacuate the crowd. There was thick smoke coming from the front of the car. The car was about to explode. Yi Muyun rushed over there, but he was bounced back by the heat wave and fell heavily back onto his own car. All the bones in his body were about to break, but he still struggled to get up and prepared to rush toward the heat wave. Whether he lived or died, he wanted to be with her. Other people, other things, none of them mattered. Chapter 2279. Another huge wave rushed towards him with a bang, and he was immediately pushed back. He was pulled back and knocked out. By the time Yi Muyun woke up, the sky had already turned dark. Her throat felt like it was on fire, and her entire body was in pain, as if she was pierced into pieces. When he opened his eyes, he was a little confused, but it only took a second for him to be completely awake. Then, he lifted the quilt mechanically and walked towards the door of the ward. Before Gu Zhe could stop him, Yi Muyun spat out a mouthful of blood. Not a mouthful, but a pool of blood, black blood. He weakly leaned his head against the door and panted. Gu Zhe, take me to see her. He didn't ask if she was dead, because deep in his heart, he couldn't accept that possibility. Gu Zhe's heart trembled, but he still quickly went forward to support him and said in a low voice, she was saved by Lan Yu. She was only slightly injured, but she has a concussion. Yi Muyun's body softened, as if he was relieved. Gu Zhe's gaze was a little complicated, and he continued to say, but Lan Yu. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes. What happened to Lan Yu? Lan Yu might become a vegetable, Gu Zhe said in a low voice. The identity of the person who hit Cher has also been found out. It's Lan Ting. Lan Ting was supposed to be dead, but she didn't die. She just became a lunatic. This time, Lan Ting was completely dead. Between Cher and Lan Ting, Lan Yu saved Cher. Gu Zhe said softly. His words were neither light nor heavy, but Mr. Yi should understand the reason behind it. Lan Yu fell in love with Cher. Only when he fell in love would he make such an impulsive choice. For the past 8 years, Lan Yu lived for Lan Ting, but this time, he gave his life to Cher. Yi Muyun propped herself up and didn't collapse. She kept looking at Gu Zhe. Bring me to see her. Gu Zhe nodded, and helped Yi Muyun out of the ward. They turned a corner and came to Cher's ward. The moment the door was opened, the room was dazzlingly white, and Cher was sitting on the bed, looking a little dazed. When she heard the voice, she looked up at him, but there was nothing but unfamiliarity in her eyes. Beside him, Guzé finally told him the truth. She has forgotten, only Lan Yu and Lan Yishu. You, me, the Tang family, Qin family, and Boyi have all forgotten. Yi Muyun felt a sweet taste in his heart, and he almost spat out another mouthful of blood, but he held it in. Pursing his lips, he walked forward slowly. When he was just one step away, he reached out and pulled Cher into his embrace. At this moment, his body was trembling, and he buried his face in her neck, saying over and over again, "I'm sorry, I won't let you leave me again." He said it over and over again, but she didn't seem to notice it. After a long time, she looked up at him and called out subconsciously, "Lan Yu." Yi Muyun was stunned. Shock was written all over his face. He finally recalled what Guzé had said, that she had forgotten everything except for Lan Yu. In her memory, Lan Yu was her husband, and she and Lan Yu were family. When Yi Muyun walked out of the ward, he spat out another mouthful of blood. As time passed, the truth slowly surfaced. Back then, Lan Ting, who jumped off the building because of him, did not die. She was just mentally ill, and Lan Yu had been coaxing her, using revenge in exchange for her inner peace. Chapter 2280. At that time, Lan Yu was in the same car as Lan Ting. At that time, he could have saved his sister. After all, it was the love that he had forbidden for so many years. But when he pushed open the car door with his bloody hand, what he wanted was to let Cher live. His mind was filled with images of what he had done to Shui that night. She was lying on the bed, fed by him, and he was crazy to force her to do that kind of thing. The shock in her eyes hurt his heart. He didn't want to admit that he let her go not because of Ishu, but he didn't want to hurt her in his heart. So, even though Lan Yu knew that she was drugged and would look for Yi Muyun, he still let her go. He had already surrendered to her. He didn't want to admit that he loved her. Until now, he hadn't said it. But if he was awake, if he could do it again, he probably wouldn't do this. He wouldn't let her go back to B City. He would think of a way to trick her into sleeping with him in New York. He would make the best of a mistake and live a peaceful life. Even if she always had Yi Muyun in her heart, even if she would never love him. With her by his side, watching her and Ishu together, watching them lying there together, he felt that life was a faint happiness. "Mr. Yi, this is what Lan Yu asked someone to tell you before he fell into a coma, but he probably didn't expect Cher to lose her memory." Guzé closed the notebook and said hesitantly, "Also, a document from New York has been sent over. It said that Mr. Lan Yu asked to pass it to you before he fell into a coma." Yi Muyun sat in the ward and said calmly, "Bring it over." Guzé handed over the tightly sealed document bag and left the room. Yi Muyun looked at the closed door and opened the document. There was a thick medical record and a DNA test inside. The test was no longer important to him because he had already confirmed it. However, the medical record made him frown and close his eyes. He was in so much pain that he almost couldn't believe what was written on it. But the strength of the strokes, the wear and tear on each page, and the English words shook his soul. Depression. She had this illness before, the same illness as Qin Mu. It was serious, even more serious than Qin Mu's. How did she survive alone in New York? Then, she and Lan Yu, might not be Lan Yu's wishful thinking. Those 5 years of love, those 5 years, they also had a child, it was something that Yi Muyun could not replace. The only thing she remembered now was Lan Yu's company. What about him? What about the 10 years they spent together? Had she forgotten all about it? After reading the documents, he finally understood why Ishu was only 5 years old and not 8. Ishu was indeed not born by Cher. When Lan Yu found her, she was pregnant and her body was indeed unable to give birth safely. The embryo was taken out and kept for 2 years using the most advanced method. During those 2 years, Xiao Ishu was still fine, but she did not grow up. In the end, Lan Yu chose a woman to implant Ishu. 8 months later, Ishu was born and was carried to Cher, saving her life. Those ice-cold words caused Yi Muyun's face to be filled with tears. Chapter 2281. This time, it wasn't about the goal anymore. It was because Lan Yu had fallen in love with Cher. She knew it in her mind, so she remembered Lan Yu and forgot about him. Yi Muyun sat alone in the ward for a long time. It wasn't until night fell that he slowly walked out of the ward. He wanted to see her. He wanted to hug her. But he couldn't find her in her ward. After standing there for a while, he quietly walked towards Lan Yu's ICU. Just yesterday, Lan Yu was announced to be in a vegetative state, and he might never wake up again. He stood outside the glass and looked at her lying beside Lan Yu's bed. Her small body was leaning against the side, and her small hand was holding Lan Yu's hand. She was so thin, so small, and her side profile looked small and pointy. He thought to himself, did she not eat for the past 2 days? At this moment, his heart was filled with sorrow. There was a feeling that couldn't be fought over, and that was that person was dead. There was no way to fight over a dead person, and there was no difference between Lan Yu and a dead person now. The crazy things that Lan Yu had done, the schemes that he had conspired against Shuai, had all disappeared with his sacrifice for Shuai. In the end, Lan Yu had left all of this to him. He was undoubtedly telling him not to force Shuai, because she had been sick before. That was great. Were they planning to love each other just like that? What about him, Yi Muyun? Until this moment, Yi Muyun could feel a deep layer of sorrow, the deep pain of being abandoned. But his little fool couldn't feel it. She could feel her own pain, Lan Yu's pain, but she couldn't feel Yi Muyun's pain. Would she never call him brother again, and would never remember him again? Yi Muyun stood quietly, watching her lifeless appearance. He was in pain with her. He was also watching her, and her pain for someone else. Cher's eyes slowly lifted up, looking at the man outside the glass. He was very thin, tall, and very good-looking. There was a hint of pain in his eyes. He always looked at her like that. Her sharp chin shifted, and her eyes widened as she stared at him like a wounded animal. His small body heaved up and down from his shallow breathing, making him look weak and small. Yi Muyun pushed open the door and walked in. She seemed to be shocked. Then, he noticed that she moved slightly towards Lan Yu's direction. In her heart, was Lan Yu someone who could give her a sense of security? Who are you? Cher bit her lips, her voice a little timid. Yi Muyun's heart felt like it was being cut by a knife. He squeezed out a smile. I'm your brother. He added, we grew up together, so we're family. Those who are not related by blood. Shuai looked at him timidly, and he waited patiently. After a long while, she pursed her lips. Did you find a good doctor to save Lan Yu? She had forgotten about him, but she remembered the last moment when Lan Yu carried her out. She remembered how she was so touched when Lan Yu stuffed Xiao Yishu into her arms when she was so sick that she was about to die. She asked him this question, but he wasn't angry at all. All that was left was a faint sadness. He only stretched out his hand and stroked her soft long hair gently. She shivered, but she didn't avoid it. Because she saw that many people here were very respectful to him. He should be a very powerful person, and she longed for him to help her. It was like a small animal's instinct, seeking someone to help her. Chapter 2282. The timid little girl looked at him and said carefully, "Can I see Ishu?" He let out a long sigh. Fortunately, she hadn't forgotten her son. He had mixed feelings about Ishu. Now, he knew that he was his son, but he couldn't admit it. He could only let her think that he was Lan Yu's son. Everything, back to what she thought she was, would be good for her condition, and would not relapse. Of course. He rubbed her long hair again and whispered, "I can do everything you want for you." He didn't tell her that in order to let Ishu live with him, he had used a lot of means, including forcing the two old things of the Lan family. But there was no need to let her know about all these ugly things. It didn't matter if she forgot everything or if she didn't know anything. She still had him. It didn't matter if he was her brother or Ishu's uncle for the rest of her life. His kindness was rewarded with a small smile from her. She gave him a shy smile, a very strange smile. But he smiled, opened his arms, and said in a low voice, "Cher, let me hug you." She didn't move. She pursed her lips, probably struggling with the fact that they were related by blood. After a long time, when he was disappointed, she still moved over and gently nestled in his arms, like a little creature seeking protection. She was still so small and soft. At this moment, he really wanted to fold her deep into his arms and let her go anywhere. But he didn't care. He had to be her brother. To hell with his brother. Yi Muyun hugged her and his eyes fell on Lan Yu's face. He thought to himself, never wake up. Best. Lan Yu didn't wake up. Cher still didn't remember him, nor did she remember Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi. However, she seemed to tacitly agree that Yi Muyun was her brother. She was a little dependent on him, but not too much. After she recovered from her injuries and was discharged from the hospital, Yi Muyun arranged for her to stay in the villa that he had prepared after their engagement, while he still lived in the apartment. On the day he was discharged from the hospital, Xiao Yishu also came over and stood beside Lan Yu's bed with Cher. Xiao Yishu wiped her tears. "Mommy, will Daddy wake up?" "Yes." Cher held the little person in her arms, her eyes quietly fell on Lan Yu. In fact, the doctor said that he might never wake up. Xiao Yishu looked at them eagerly and then placed her favorite little bear on Lan Yu's bedside. "The little bear will accompany Daddy, and Yishu will accompany Mommy." Yi Muyun stood at the door and looked at the family of three. He felt particularly upset. The wife was clearly his, and the child was also his. Now that Lan Yu had fallen, everything had become Lan Yu's. He touched his nose and looked at Gu Zhe opposite him. Gu Zhe's expression was a little meaningful. Therefore, Mr. Yi felt even more upset in his heart, but he still had to wait patiently. "Mr. Yi, haste makes waste." Gu Zhe rarely made a joke, and his voice was a little low. Mr. Yi was now walking into a dead end. If he didn't become her good brother, he couldn't get close to her. If he became her good brother, how could he sleep in the future? Tang Cher, who had lost her memory, only thought that she and Lan Yu were true love. How could she let her brother sleep with her? Chapter 2283. Yi Muyun had more or less guessed his thoughts. She looked at him and glared at him fiercely. Gu Zhe smiled and didn't take it seriously. "I'll wait downstairs." Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi's attitude was quite interesting. They didn't care much about Lan Yu's vegetative state. Instead, they left Cher in Yi Muyun's care. They knew that Mr. Yi was the alpha wolf, but they weren't afraid that their daughter would be eaten again. However, Lan Yu was in such a state. It was not a big deal even if he was eaten. Lan Yu could still jump around. After Gu Zhe left, Yi Muyun waited for a while. The adult and the child didn't seem to want to come out. It seemed that they were going to cry. He walked to the end of the corridor, lit a cigarette, and smoked slowly. He was thinking about what to do in the future. How should he treat her? After half an hour, the two little ones still didn't show any signs of coming out. Yi Muyun put out the cigarette, strode into the ward, and carried Xiao Yishu. It's done. Come to see Daddy next time. He said these two words through gritted teeth. Xiao Yishu was still sobbing in his arms. I want Daddy. Uncle will be here in the future, he said coldly. He put his face against Xiao Yishu's. After that, he smelled a milky fragrance. It was exactly the same as Cher's when she was young. He couldn't help but look at Cher. She was still staring at Lan Yu. That scene made Yi Muyun feel really uncomfortable. But no matter how uncomfortable it was, he had to endure it. He still had to serve the adult and the child. He was an elder brother and an uncle, right? He had to behave well. Today, he wore a light brown sweater with a beige coat. He looked very handsome. Even with Xiao Yishu in his arms, his handsomeness didn't diminish. When Cher left, she looked back at Lan Yu. Her eyes were full of nostalgia. Brother, can I come to see him every day? She said carefully and tugged at his sleeve. Yi Muyun took a deep breath and said gently in his best manner, as long as you have time. Oh, Cher said, and followed him in the elevator all the way to the first floor. He was driving a black Maybach, so there was a lot of space in the back seat. Yishu was lying beside Shue's legs, still in low spirits. After a while, she raised her head and asked with tears in her eyes, why didn't Daddy come home? Because Daddy needs treatment in the hospital. Cher reached out and touched Yishu's soft hair. Xiao Yishu howled and stopped talking. He lay there, looking at the back of that uncle. Uncle Yi seemed to like Mummy very much. Uncle Yi said that he was Mummy's brother. But Uncle Ye's surname was Yi. Could he always hold Mummy like this? Even Daddy didn't have much chance to hold Mummy. Yi Muyun buckled his seatbelt and felt an eager gaze from behind. He turned around and saw that it was his son. He smiled faintly and started the car without saying anything. Half an hour later, the car drove into a quiet villa. It wasn't very big, but the decoration was very exquisite. Cher looked at the photo on the porch. She picked it up and pursed her lips. Our photo. It was probably taken many years ago. They were both young and inexperienced, and they looked very intimate. Chapter 2284. Yi Muyun carried the luggage in one hand and looked at her puzzled expression. He explained, we used to have a good relationship, so it's not strange for us to have a few photos together. This villa, he smiled. I gave it to you on your 18th birthday. That was true, but they didn't have time to live here before she went to New York. Now that she and Yishu could live here, it could be considered as fulfilling his wish. Cher nodded in acknowledgement, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Wasn't this brother a little too nice? She heard that he was in charge of Boyi now. She wasn't surprised because he looked like a man who exuded the aura of an elite. Then, she looked at her face and suddenly blushed. It was a little hot, and she didn't dare to look at him again. I'll take Yishu upstairs. He probably wants to sleep, she said hurriedly, and then took Xiao Yishu's little hand. The little guy shook his head. Mom, I'm not sleepy. Yi Muyun watched her run upstairs from downstairs and smiled. The first room on the east side is yours. The one on the left is Yishu's. She paused for a moment, and then hurried again. I have something to talk to you about later, he said seriously, looking like a good brother. Cher said, oh, from upstairs, and then there was the sound of the door opening and closing. Coward. Yi Muyun recalled how she blushed and smiled. He felt that she wasn't that bad now. Perhaps if he, as her brother, seduced her, she would take the initiative to throw herself at him. He brought the luggage in, changed his shoes, and took off his thin coat. The sweater inside was quite slim. He had found a few reliable servants to take care of her here. They knew her character, but they were also very reliable. He ordered the servants to prepare dinner and gave some instructions. Then, he sat down and took care of some work on his phone. She came down. Yin Muyun put away his phone and said casually, "Is Ishu asleep?" She came down and sat opposite him awkwardly. She shook her head. No. Then, her eyes fell on him and she looked at him for a while. He noticed it too. He smiled and said calmly, "This is your house. You don't have to be restrained." He paused. "I've said that we are very close. We are closer than ordinary siblings." Cher didn't say anything. "All right, I want to talk to you about Ishu." As Yi Muyin spoke, he calmly sat down beside her. Although he wasn't too close, she could still smell that unique manly scent on his body. Cher sat up straight like a primary school student. For some reason, she was afraid of him. Although he was very good to her, and she could feel that he was really good to her, not only to her, but also to Ishu, she was still afraid of him. She pursed her lips and said in a low voice, "Ishu." Yi Muyun didn't talk about it immediately. Instead, he said gently, "You're afraid of me and don't dare to look me in the eye." Shuai was taken aback. She looked up at him and said, "No, I didn't." But she lowered her eyes as though it was a sin to look at him. Yi Muyun smiled faintly and hooked her chin. His voice turned husky. "What are you afraid of? I'm not going to eat you up." Chapter 2285. Lan Yu had become like that. She had been feeling sad in a silly manner, but he wasn't sad. He didn't have any burden in his heart. As long as she was willing, he could do it with her any time. Now, he had basically confirmed that they were a fake couple. If they had done something, Lan Yu wouldn't have needed to drug her that night, and she wouldn't have needed to look for him to be the antidote. His heart softened, but he couldn't get close to her, and he couldn't tell her the truth. She had such an illness. How could he dare to provoke her? Qin Mu said that he could only seduce her. She said that Cher couldn't resist his physical body. Yi Muyun didn't know when his sister had become so shameless. She probably learned it from Zhou Chongguang. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but he couldn't say anything. At this moment, looking at Cher, he actually had some thoughts in his mind. After all, he was a grown man. After her accident, he hadn't touched a woman for about a month. Now that she was in front of him, he would naturally think about her. Cher pursed her lips and replied with an "oh." He chuckled and pinched her little face. "You're still saying you're not afraid of me?" "Huh?" She bit her lip. Actually, she wasn't afraid of him. It was just that if he wasn't so handsome and didn't treat her so well, she would probably be able to talk to him properly. She felt a little ashamed. He said that they were brother and sister, but when she looked at him and talked, she would look at his Adam's apple and think that it looked really good. She actually had the urge to bite it, to taste it, to see if it tasted good. She was ashamed, so she naturally didn't dare to look at him and spoke awkwardly. "She had a husband. I've said before that we used to have a good relationship." He smiled gently, looking very gentle. Cher bit her lip. "How good were we?" Yi Muyun looked at her eyes and sighed in his heart. She seemed to be a little dumber than before. But that was good. It was easy to fool her. "When we were young, I was the one who took care of you. We used to sleep together until your menarche came." He said half of the truth. The other half of the truth was that when she grew up, she still slept with him. Because of his words, Cher was stunned. She really couldn't understand why they were sleeping together. But from the looks of it, he didn't seem to be lying. If you are afraid at night, I can accompany you. As her brother, he said something serious without any pressure. Cher blushed. I'm not afraid. He smiled faintly and didn't say much. Instead, he returned to the topic at hand. By the way, Ishu is already 5 years old. She should have started school a long time ago. Lanyu, do you have any plans? Cher pursed her lips. Yes, I wanted to attend it in New York. But now, Lanyu couldn't leave, and she and Ishu couldn't go back to New York. Yi Muyun gave her a piece of information and said lightly, this is the information of a kindergarten. Take a look. If it's okay, then go to this one. Cher was stunned for a moment. Isn't it too fast? She said shyly, Ishu doesn't seem to want to go to school. I know, you were the same when you were young. As he said that, he smiled. I'll convince him. I believe that if I could handle a little girl in the past, I should be able to handle a little boy too. Cher felt deeply insulted, but she couldn't find any words to refute. Chapter 2286. Cher's head drooped even lower. He did not make things difficult for her and instead took a step back. Let's go after the new year. Rest well at home for the time being since it's only 2 months away. As he said that, his heart softened a little. So what if he was an elder brother? They were no different from a married couple, they just didn't sleep together. Cher heaved a sigh of relief. It would be fine if there were 2 more months. She pursed her lips and replied, in that case, I'll bring Ishu over some other day. You can come along too, Yi Muyun said calmly before stroking her hair. I'll help you carry your luggage upstairs. You can pack up and rest for a while. I'll wake you up for dinner. He said it so naturally as though he had lived with her for a long time. She wanted to distance herself from him but was also a little embarrassed. In the end, she followed behind him and watched as he pushed open her bedroom door. My bedroom is opposite. You can share the study with me in my bedroom. Cher was surprised. You're staying here too. I'll be staying here for the next few days. He explained calmly. I'll leave once you and Ishu are used to it. Oh. She had no reason to retort. If he wanted to stay, then so be it. Their relationship was great. As she thought about it, she felt relieved. Yi Muyun directly carried her things to the changing room. Actually, there were only a few pieces of clothes that needed to be packed. Instead, there were a few cabinets of clothes that had been prepared in the changing room, and the tags had not been removed. She was a little surprised as she tilted her head to look at him. Yi Muyun said calmly, I prepared them 2 days ago. They were all bought according to your measurements. Oh. Cher saw that there were even lingerie and panties. Her face blushed a little. Even though he was an elder brother, wasn't it a little too intimate to prepare these? And he wasn't even her biological brother. She hung up the clothes and walked out. He had already left. Cher looked at the bedroom. It was a purely feminine room, as though it was for a girl. She recalled that he had said that this was her 18th birthday present. No matter what, she still had to thank him. Thus, with caution, she walked to the opposite bedroom. The door wasn't closed tightly, so he should be in there. Cher knocked on the door and got a response from inside. She didn't think too much about it and pushed the door open. However, he wasn't in the bedroom. She only saw his jacket in the living room. Thinking that he was in the study, she searched for the layout of the house and wanted to find him. However, after taking a few steps, she found herself in the bedroom. On the bed in the bedroom, there were shirts, belts and trousers scattered messily. It was quite a visual impact. Cher guessed that he was taking a shower. When she was about to leave, her eyes fell on a set of enlarged photos on the bedside table. It was still a photo of her and him, but it seemed a little too intimate. He was wearing a sweater, and she was wearing a shirt, obviously a man's, nestled in his arms. They didn't look like siblings, but more like a couple. Cher stared blankly. Her mouth was dry and her tongue was agitated. Right at this moment, Yi Muyun stood at the entrance of the bathroom and said calmly, "We were together." Together. These 4 words struck Snow like a bolt of lightning, striking her in the back of her mind. It was just like when he said that he was her elder brother. She had no doubt about it. After all, such photos were indeed taken by people who were in love. Chapter 2287. She couldn't remember, but at this moment, she felt a little uneasy because she knew. She looked up and saw that he was wearing a bathrobe and looked like he had just taken a shower. His short black hair was still wet. Cher pursed her lips and said softly, "Why didn't you say so earlier?" Yi Muyun walked over slowly and took out a bottle of red wine from a cabinet. He poured himself a glass and took a sip before saying slowly, "It was a long time ago. It's not important now. What's important is that I'm your brother now." How was it not important? Cher bit her lip. She wanted to cry but no tears came out. He only told her that they had been together after she moved in. And she bit her lip, not daring to ask him about the important things. She bit her lip so hard that it was about to bleed. He obviously knew what she was thinking and smiled. "Are you going to ask me if we've slept together, huh?" Cher's face was burning hot. She stammered, "That shouldn't be important." She looked up again and licked her lips. Her gaze landed on the collar of his bathrobe. Yi Muyun leaned against his body and smiled lazily. "You don't think it's important?" Cher nodded and lowered her head, not daring to look at him anymore. She was afraid that if she continued to look, she would pounce on him. Yi Muyun put down the glass in his hand and walked slowly to her. He was wearing indoor slippers and there was no sound when he stepped on the carpet. She only noticed him when he was right in front of her. She raised her eyes and looked at him. Her body subconsciously moved backward, but she fell right onto the soft bed. Yi Muyun took a step forward and bent down slightly. Her eyes widened. His handsome face was very close to her, so close that she could feel his breathing, a little hurried and hot. However, he clearly looked very calm. She was the one who was not calm. Cher bit her lip and didn't dare to breathe loudly. He was still looking at her, his gaze deep. She couldn't take it anymore. She pushed him away with her little hand, but her fingers came into contact with a burning sensation. She quickly retracted her hand and didn't dare to move anymore. She turned her face to the side and said, "I don't want to know anymore." Then, she buried her face in the bedsheets. "I'm married." Obviously, it was inappropriate to talk about this. She was scared to death and her voice was weak. She wanted to push him away, but she didn't dare. At this moment, she truly felt that he was a man, a mature and aggressive man. Yi Muyun stuck close to her but didn't go any further. He just looked down at her and said in a hoarse voice, "Do you really not want to know?" Cher closed her eyes tightly and said, "I don't want to. But I want to." His voice was hoarse. Cher was stunned for a moment. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He chuckled and whispered in her ear, "We did it on the night of your 18th birthday." She was completely shocked. She lay on the bed and looked at him, not knowing what to do. Yi Muyun chuckled. Looking at her terrified and hopeless expression, he didn't do anything to her in the end. He quickly got up and let her get up. Cher was extremely uncomfortable. She bounced up and said, "I'm going back to my room." Her arm was caught and the next second, she fell into his arms. She smelled it. It smelled good. It was a very, very masculine scent. It was refreshing and it was so good that she wanted to go up and smell it again. Chapter 2288. Yimuyun chuckled hoarsely and hugged her in his arms. Scared? He then bit her little ear. "I'm lying, silly." He was lying to her. Cher was shocked again. She stammered, "Can you lie to me about something like this?" Yimuyun laughed even more wantonly as he whispered beside her ear, "Are you disappointed?" Disappointed? Cher raised her eyes and stared at him. She didn't quite understand what he meant. But even though she had lost her memory, she was still a grown woman and she quickly understood what he meant. Her little face was very red and her eyes were watery as she glared at him. But such a glare made her look so weak. In front of him, she was so weak. Yimuyun looked at her, feeling indescribably touched. She was afraid of him now, just like how she was afraid of him when they were young. Even though she was afraid, she still wanted to get close to him. He reached out and hugged her, burying his face in her hair as he said gently, "Cher, you still have me." Cher bit her lip and stayed in his arms obediently, resting her chin on his shoulder. After a while, she asked softly, "Brother, do you have a girlfriend?" Yimuyun smiled and reached out to stroke her long hair. "No." "Have you?" she asked secretly. She did not know why, but she just wanted to know. Yimuyun's eyes were burning as he stared at her for a long time before he smiled. "Yes." She replied with an "oh" and did not say anything more, feeling a little uncomfortable. But she was wondering why she was so concerned about this. He was just her brother. She should be more concerned about Lan Yu in the hospital. Yes, Lan Yu. She and Lan Yu were in love, right? Cher's head hurt as she looked up at the man in front of her. At this moment, the one who gave her the greatest sense of security was not Lan Yu, but Yimuyun, a man who could be considered as her brother. She lowered her eyes and did not dare to look at his overly handsome face again. She said softly, "Then I'll go back and rest." She carefully moved away, inch by inch, towards the door, like a timid kitten. That look made Yimuyun feel both angry and amused. Now that he had forgotten about it, he had reverted to his former self. Just as her hand was on the doorknob, his voice rang out. "Have you forgotten what you came here to say?" So the little kitten's fur instantly stood up again. It turned around and looked at him eagerly. It also remembered its purpose and bit its little mouth, which was so red that it looked like blood was about to drip out. "Thank you, what are you thanking me for?" He leaned against the bar again and sipped his red wine. His voice was very faint. He was only wearing a pure white bathrobe. It was simple, but it was ridiculously good-looking. His collar was slightly loosened, revealing his exquisite collarbone. The muscles underneath were so strong that even Cher felt an urge to step forward and have a taste of him. She looked at him and unconsciously licked her lower lip. In a low voice, she said, "Thank you for taking me in." Yimuyun smiled and put down the glass in his hand. "It's my responsibility to take care of you and Ishu. You don't have to stand on ceremony." His words had a double meaning, but she was too stupid to catch it. Her face was hot, and after a while, she said in a low voice, "I'll go out first." Then, she fled in a fluster. Yimuyun stretched out her hand and lightly touched the transparent goblet. Her expression was somewhat unfathomable. Chapter 2289. If he forced himself on her, he would probably frighten her. Even though she looked like she was drooling over his body, Gu Mengmeng couldn't help it. Yi Muyun smiled faintly. Lan Yu was in a vegetative state. This time, Lan Ting was dead. He and Cher could take their time. Perhaps after a year or so, when her guilt towards Lan Yu cooled down, he could tell her that their marriage didn't exist, and then, he thought about it a lot, but it was just a thought. Now, as long as he could be with her and take care of her, it was already good enough. He picked up the glass of red wine, drank it in one gulp, and slowly walked into the study to deal with Bo Yi's affairs. Cher tossed and turned in her bedroom, unable to fall asleep. Halfway through, she went to Xiao Yishu's room and found the little girl sleeping soundly with a pink pig in her arms. She was stunned. This little pig was prepared by Yi Muyun. Yishu had been very delicate since she was young, but now he was going to raise Xiao Yishu like a girl. Cher didn't agree with this. When Lan Yu wasn't around, she would always be Yishu's mother. She could only vaguely remember the past with Lan Yu. The most clear thing was that Lan Yu saved her. She remembered that when he put her down, his body was covered in wounds and blood. Cher buried her face in one side of the pillow, feeling a little guilty. He was lying in the hospital, and she had evil thoughts about her brother. This couldn't be, absolutely not. From tomorrow onwards, she would keep a distance from him, yes, keep a distance. With this thought in mind, she slowly fell asleep. When she woke up, a pleasant smell floated past her nose. Her long eyelashes trembled, and her eyes were a little sore, so she didn't open them. Her little hands hugged the pillow like Xiao Yishu, and she even rubbed her little face against it. However, what she hugged didn't seem to be a pillow, but a person. When she opened her eyes, she saw the enlarged image of Jun Yen. His beautiful dark eyes were staring at her. Cher suddenly became shy, and her little hands suddenly loosened. "Why are you here?" "You." Yi Muyun smiled faintly, then straightened his body and reached out to push a strand of her long hair to one side. His action was very intimate. Cher thought in her heart, even if they were kissing, they wouldn't be this intimate. Shouldn't she clarify things with him? After struggling for a while, she finally sat up and wrapped her small body in the blanket. Without looking at him, she said in a very low voice, "We should keep our distance." Keep a distance. Yi Muyun's gaze landed lightly on her, and there was a hint of a smile on her face. "What do we have to maintain? Or are you thinking too much after all this contact?" As he spoke, he reached out and curled up a strand of her hair, slowly playing with it. He was so strong, and she was so weak. In the end, she bit her little mouth and snorted softly. Her little temper was rising. He sighed in his heart. She was still the same as when she was young, ignoring people when her temper flared up. He knew when to stop and smiled faintly. "All right, I'll go carry Ishu downstairs. You should also tidy up and go downstairs for dinner." Cher stopped him. "Wait a minute." He was about to leave, but he turned his head. In that instant, Shui was blinded. Because he was too good-looking. Chapter 2290. Cher stared at him blankly, forgetting to say anything. "What do you want to say?" His tone was gentle as he stood there calmly. Cher bit her lip. After her mind went blank, she said in a low voice, "I want to talk to you about Ishu." He replied softly before leaning against the door, looking as though he wanted to listen to her. He even took out a cigarette and played with it in his hand. However, he remembered that this was her bedroom, so he did not smoke. Cher pursed her lips and said in a clear voice, "I'm saying that Ishu is a boy." "I know," Yi Muyun replied calmly, his gaze landing on her face. With him looking at her like that, she felt that it was difficult to talk to him. She lowered her eyes. I'm saying that Ishu is a boy and he can walk by himself. Yi Muyun's gaze became even more indifferent, but there was a smile in it that she could not see. What about you? You're not a boy. Do you want me to carry you? No. She replied quickly and stupidly. Oh no. She realized that she had been played by him again. She firmly believed that there was definitely nothing going on between them in the past because he was so despicable. He must have bullied her often in the past. Cher leaned against the headboard and glared at him. She did not look like a little mother at all. Yi Muyun's heart softened. He could not bear to tease her anymore, so he walked over and kissed her forehead. His voice was soft and gentle. I took care of you like this in the past. Of course, I'm going to take care of Ishu the same way now. He paused for a moment before saying, Ishu is only 5 years old. It's okay to carry you. I carried you until you were 12. You were only willing to walk when you were in junior high. His words caused Shuer to feel deeply ashamed. She was only willing to walk when she was in junior high. Even though it was shameful, she would still fight for it. She just did not have enough confidence. Ishu is a boy. Don't spoil him too much. His gaze became a little deep as he looked at her just like that. Her heart trembled slightly, but she didn't dare to say anything else. After a long time, he took a step forward and said very slowly, if that's what you want, I'll cooperate. Cher had a nagging feeling that there was something wrong with their conversation. She had never thought that this was a conversation between husband and wife, talking about the child's education. She scratched her hair and looked up at him. Okay. However, he slowly opened his mouth again, but I still think it's better to let him be independent in another year. He had just become a father, so it was natural for him to spoil her a little more, but she didn't understand. They didn't need to understand. They just needed to be doted on by him. Ah! Cher gasped, then froze. Yi Muyun. She called his name angrily. This was the first time she was angry at him since she lost her memory. Yi Muyun chuckled. You don't call me brother anymore, huh? He was really too despicable. Cher didn't want to bother with him. You're not my brother to begin with. After saying that, she regretted it. After all, he treated her very well. Other than guilt, she also felt uneasy. Because after her accident, her parents didn't seem to like her very much. They left after seeing her for a while, and the one taking care of her was this brother. If this brother didn't take care of her, it would probably be quite difficult for her to support herself and Xiao Yishu in her current state. It wasn't because of money. It was because she and Yishu had a similar understanding of this society. Chapter 2291. Of course, she could choose to go to the Lawn family, but unfortunately, the two elders of the Lawn family looked at her with a complicated expression. They had no intention of asking her to bring Xiao Yishu back to the Lawn family. In the end, besides feeling sad for Lan Yu, she realized that no one wanted her. Luckily, she had an older brother. Cher had her own plans. After a long while, she gave in without batting an eyelid. Nodding her head, she said, "You're right, brother." His gaze was on her. Under the warm yellow light, it was a little profound. She called him brother, and Xiao Yishu was their child. This was a taboo. Men had bad habits, especially men like Yi Muyun, who hid them deeply. He only looked at her for a while before smiling and walking out. After a while, she heard him coming down the stairs. Cher sat for a while before she got up to change her clothes. She washed her face and went downstairs. In the dining room downstairs, the aroma of food wafted through the air. It was appetizing. Xiao Yishu was already sitting at the dining table. His little body was wrapped in a white napkin. It was cotton and had a picture of a little pig on it. Cher bet that this was definitely not something that Yishu used to have. Because Yishu was already 5 years old and could eat well on his own, he didn't need this. And this was something that Yi Muyun had prepared for him. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. After sitting down, she reminded him softly, Yishu won't get food on him anymore. He's 5 years old. I have to learn how to take care of a child from the beginning. As Yi Muyun spoke, she smiled faintly. Schwaber, you can completely hand Yishu over to me. But you have to go to work. She bit her lip and said. Yi Muyun chuckled. I can bring him to the office. Why don't you come with me? Ha! That didn't seem to be a problem. Just as Cher was about to agree, Xiao Yishu said pitifully while forking the food with her fork, what about Daddy? Can I go to Uncle's company too? All the romantic thoughts in Yi Muyun's mind flew away in an instant. The image in his mind was that he was working while Lan Yu was lying on the side, half dead. In an instant, he lost his appetite. He looked at Xiao Yishu and said gently, maybe not, but Uncle can bring Yishu to see Dad often. Daddy will wake up, right? Xiao Yishu's eyes were filled with tears. Now he missed Lan Yu very much. After all, he was brought up by Lan Yu. How could he not have feelings for him? Yi Muyun sighed and reached out to touch his son's hair. It was soft, and his heart softened. Although he didn't like Lan Yu, he wouldn't say such dark things in front of the child. He nodded and said, of course. However, in his heart, he really wanted to instruct the doctor to secretly remove Lan Yu's oxygen supply. That way, he wouldn't jump out and snatch his wife and child away from him. The doctor said that it wasn't impossible for Lan Yu to wake up. As long as he had strong willpower and couldn't let go, he would wake up. Before that, he wanted to make Cher his, from body to heart. Of course, Yishu was more difficult than Cher. After all, in Yishu's heart, Lan Yu was his father. Chapter 2292. Mr. Ye's heart was breaking down. How was he going to date the child's mother in the future? The little girl kept mentioning the half-dead Lan Yu with tears in her eyes. Mr. Yi felt that there was no way he could continue living like this. Cher's mood also became gloomy. She didn't say a word and just kept eating. Yi Muyun's head was aching. The little bit of warmth that had been established in the afternoon was now gone. He pursed his thin lips and didn't say anything. He just stuffed a few more rolls into Xiao Yishu's little mouth and said gently, Uncle has a lot here. If you want to bring some back for Daddy, I'll get someone to make more. His voice was soft, but it was mean. How could a child understand? But Cher was keenly aware of it. He was very good to Yishu, but he seemed to have some prejudice against Lan Yu. She glanced at him, and he naturally noticed it too. So he smiled and forked a few pieces into her little mouth. I remember you liked to eat this when you were young. The two little ones, one big and one small, were stuffed to the brim. Especially Cher, who puffed up her cheeks and looked especially dissatisfied. That embarrassed look made him calm down. He reached out and touched his forehead, smiling bitterly. Why was he arguing with a vegetable? Children would slowly forget. As for her, he could slowly seduce her. But even though he thought so, he couldn't help but feel jealous. Jealous of those 8 blank years. She spent them with Lan Yu. Cher looked at Yi Muyun and pursed her lips. She started to feel that he was angry. She was sensitive and smart, so she didn't say a word and buried her head in the food. Xiao Yishu wasn't a very talkative child. After eating, she obediently ran to the sofa and scribbled. The little girl was chubby. She lay there, and only her fat little butt could be seen. Yi Muyun's mood had calmed down. He looked at Ishu for a while and his eyes became gentler. His eyes seemed to be recalling something. Cher couldn't help looking at him again. When he turned around, she quickly lowered her head. You seem to have eaten a lot. You seem to have a good appetite, he said lightly. Cher nodded and looked at him. I'm a little hungry. Still, you can't eat too much at once. It's not good for your stomach, Anne. He said slowly, then picked up a glass of wine and sipped it. Aren't girls afraid of getting fat the most? Aren't you afraid of getting fat after eating so much? Cher replied slowly, anyway, Lan Yu hasn't woken up yet. It won't be too late to reduce it when he wakes up. He looked at her for a moment. She really knew how to make him angry. However, he had been angry enough today. He stood up and said in a calm tone, I'll accompany you. But just as he walked over, he got angry again. That was because Xiao Yishu was drawing Lan Yu. That chubby boy pointed at the drawing and asked energetically, Uncle, look at my drawing of Daddy, Mummy, and Ishu. Isn't it great? Yi Muyun's gaze landed on the drawing quietly. It was actually quite well drawn. It was cute and ugly, and the family of three was very harmonious. However, this sort of harmony made him extremely uncomfortable. He looked at his son and coughed gently. You can draw Uncle on it too. Little Chubby's brush landed on the left and right sides. After that, he was put in a difficult position as he looked up at Yi Muyun. Uncle, it doesn't seem to be suitable anywhere. Chapter 2293. So Mr. Yi reached out to hold the little boy and rubbed his face against him. Why not? Chubby boy was a little shy to be hugged like this, but he still let him hug him. The little boy hesitated for a while before saying, Uncle Yi, do you want to be Daddy's mistress or Mommy's mistress? Yi Muyun was also stunned. He didn't expect his son to ask such a question. The atmosphere became a little subtle. After all, it was a matter of men and women, and Cher had also heard it. Naturally, this question could not be answered casually. Yi Muyun slowly raised his eyes and looked at Cher. He said slowly, What do you think? Cher brushed her hair and turned her little face to one side. Ishu is talking nonsense. What if he's not talking nonsense? His tone was intentionally or unintentionally provocative. How could someone of Snow's rank be able to endure something like that? Her little face blushed and her little neck drooped down like a little wife. He smiled in his heart and secretly scolded her for being an idiot. Then his eyes fell on her little face and did not move away. And Xiao Yishu quietly drew Uncle Yi on the side of her mother, but the drawing was a little far away. She also wrote on it in crooked characters, Yi Sansan. Let me see. Yi Muyun's tone was light, but it was very intimidating. Xiao Yishu held the drawing in her arms and twisted her fat little body to prevent him from looking. That little look was exactly the same as Cher when she was young. Yi Muyun smiled in his heart, but his face was serious. You don't want to show me. You want to hit the pussy. Xiao Yishu simply lay on the sofa and looked at him with her pussy, as if she was not afraid of him at all. In particular, she deliberately shook it, which made Yi Muyun not know whether to laugh or cry. Then he looked at the child's mother, his handsome face expressionless. Exactly the same as you when you were young. Just like a scoundrel. Cher covered her face, unwilling to admit it. Yi Muyun looked at it and smiled. He seemed to be in a good mood. He bent down and picked up the chubby little thing with one hand. With the other hand, he took the book from the little thing's hand and looked at it carefully. The drawing was not bad. It was just that she had drawn him a little ugly. Expressionlessly, he tore Lan Yu's name from the side. Then, only the family of 3 was left in the book. That's good. Yi Muyun happily returned the notebook to Xiao Yishu and threatened, draw according to this in the future. He went upstairs after he was done. Xiao Yishu looked at the book and then at her mama. She looked like she was about to cry. That was possible. He didn't want a bad uncle, he wanted a father. But the bad uncle was very powerful. He whispered to himself that if he wanted his father to wake up, he had to listen to him. Xiao Yishu didn't want to. But Xiao Yishu was afraid that if she didn't listen to the bad uncle, he would use magic to make her father never wake up again. Tears streamed down Yishu's cheeks. She cried so hard that she couldn't catch her breath. She said, "Mommy, if you kiss Daddy, will he wake up?" Cher paused. Did this child read too many fairy tales? Xiao Yishu cried really sadly. Her father didn't wake up, and her mother was occupied by the bad uncle. Chapter 2294. The little guy wailed. He didn't want his mother to be eaten. The little bun cried for a long time, and Cher tried to coax him for a long time. In the study of the master bedroom upstairs, Yi Muyun didn't deal with his work. With these 2 around, how could he be in the mood to work? His slender body leaned against the railing of the balcony casually. He held a cigarette in his hand, but he didn't take a deep puff. He didn't let the cigarette go out. At this time, it was already the beginning of winter, and there was a thin layer of fog in the night sky. Looking at it, there was a hazy sense of beauty. Yi Muyun had been a businessman since he was in his teens, and had never had the opportunity or the mood to enjoy such a beautiful scenery. Even when he and Cher occasionally looked at the night view, it was just to keep her company. At this time, he was in a leisurely mood, even though Bo-yi had so many things to do. In the small garden of the villa, a thin layer of fog rose, drowning the flowers and grass in the thin white mist. It looked cold, but his mood was warm at this time. Just listening to the sound of Xiao Yishu made people feel, especially happy. He really was exactly the same as Cher when she was a child. Before, Cher actually didn't suspect that Yishu was her child at all. He was hopelessly stupid. Yi Muyun smiled faintly and took a puff of the cigarette. Then he took out his phone and made a call. "Mr. Yi." The person said respectfully. Yi Muyun looked relaxed and asked casually, "How is Lan Yu?" The person immediately replied, "Don't worry, Mr. Yi. Lan Yu won't wake up. Even if it's possible, we won't let him wake up." Yi Muyun was about to say something when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He said faintly to the person on the phone, "You know what to do." On the other side, he was still wiping his cold sweat, but Yi Muyun had already hung up the phone. When the person behind him was an arm's length away, he suddenly reached out and pulled her in front of him, pressing her against the railing in front of him. Cher bit her lips, tears welling up in her eyes because her back was hurting. He stared at her for a moment and said indifferently, "It's you." Although he said that, he had no intention of letting go of her. Cher bit her lip and said softly, "You're hurting me. Who told you to stand behind me quietly?" He paused and pulled her closer. His large palm pressed flat against her back and gently rubbed it. His actions were very gentle and harmless, but she was not used to it. She took a step back and bumped into the railing behind her again. This time, it hurt a little. Tears fell from her eyes and she let out a mournful cry. "Why are you panicking?" He scolded her and pulled her into his arms. Her little face was pressed against his shoulder, and she smelled his pleasant scent again. She felt a little dizzy. This feeling made the pain on his back lessen a little, and he even somewhat forgot about it. But when his palm pressed against her back, she couldn't help but cry out softly, "It hurts." "Does it still hurt like this?" He moved a little, and she cried out again. It was quite a pitiful cry. Yi Muyun looked at her and his gaze darkened. He carried her up and walked towards his bedroom. Cher hooked her arms around his neck and said in a low voice, "I'm fine. Put me down." Chapter 2295. He quickly walked back to the bedroom and carefully laid her face down on his bed. A man and a woman. Under the warm yellow light, he went over to close the door. No matter how one looked at it, it was very intimate. When he came back, Cher wanted to turn over and get up, but her back hurt and her movements were a little slow. He reached out and pressed her shoulder, firmly and gently pressing her back. "Don't move, let me check." Only CEO Yi could act like a hooligan with a straight face. Cher was a little embarrassed lying on her stomach. If she insisted on getting up now, it was not that she couldn't, but it would make both of them even more uncomfortable. How were they going to get along in the future? The little scheme in her heart made her secretly endure it. She held back her tears in her heart. She had been living under someone else's roof with Xiao Yishu, and it was so difficult. Yi Muyun saw that she was being obedient and sat down slowly. Cher felt the mattress sink a little, and then she felt his strong breath on the skin on her back. She was a little shy and bit her lip. "I don't need to take off my clothes, right? You're hurt there. Let me take it off and take a look." Then she felt a warm palm pressing gently. It was a little painful and a little sore. "Are you hurt?" Her little face was buried in the bedsheets. Her voice was muffled and had a slight tremble. He looked at her lightly and then lowered his head to her ear. "It's a little bruised. I'll go find some medicine and apply it, okay?" She couldn't reject him because she didn't dare to get up. If she got up now, she would be seen naked. She bit her lip and replied softly. She felt him leave the bed. She heard the sound of the door opening. He must have gone out. Cher buried her face. Shen sighed. Gosh, how did they end up like this? She felt a sense of danger. She only wanted someone to take care of her, but why did she spend half of the time in his bedroom in less than 24 hours after returning home with him? Moreover, she was the one who sent them over. Was he too aggressive, or was she too passionate on the inside? She didn't quite remember how loving she was with Lan Yu, but Lan Yu saved her, so their relationship should be very good, right? Cher pursed her lips and hammered the bed sheets with her fist. She felt that she was quite shameless. On one hand, she longed for Lan Yu's kindness, but on the other hand, she coveted Yi Muyun's care. Right now, her impression of her brother was that he was very elite, very good-looking, and also very lecherous. Did he treat all women like this and accept them all? As her imagination ran wild, the bedroom door opened again. Yi Muyun held a tube of medicine in his hand and closed the door with one hand. He stood by the door and looked at the beautiful scene on the bed. His Adam's apple unconsciously moved. She definitely didn't know how beautiful she was just lying there, and how much she moved his heart. He looked at her quietly for a while before walking over. His steps were a little light, but she could still feel his approach. Her voice was a little shaky. "Brother." At this moment, it was a little inappropriate to call his name. She felt that it was safe to call him brother, but she didn't know that calling a man brother in bed was the biggest seduction. At least, it would make a man's blood boil. At this moment, Yi Muyun was one of them. Cher felt a warm sensation on her back. It was just a light touch. Was that applying medicine, or why was it warm? Why did she feel that he was kissing her? Chapter 2296. She was almost certain that he was kissing her. Her mind went blank. After a long time, the warmth finally ended. She almost cried and called out, "Brother." He seemed to sigh. Then he put his face against her ear and asked softly, "Are you feeling better?" How could she feel better when he kissed her like that? However, although her back didn't hurt anymore, the feeling was magnified many times. No. She lay on her stomach and cried. She wanted him to leave her, but she didn't dare to. She felt that if she said it, he would probably do something worse. She was so weak and helpless, and it would only make him want to bully her even more. "Are you afraid of me?" He leaned against her ear and laughed softly. She cried and replied, "Yes." "What are you afraid of?" he said, and suddenly intertwined their fingers. Cher closed her eyes slightly and didn't dare to breathe loudly. And he bit her earlobe gently. "Afraid that I will kiss you again?" "Yes." Schwapper was stunned. Because he admitted that he was kissing her just now. She paused and didn't make a sound for a long time. Her little face was buried and her little body was trembling. At this moment, their situation was not much better than if they had really done it. At this moment, she really felt that this brother of hers had a strong interest in her body. One had to know that there was a limit to teasing. Her voice was trembling. "Don't," he laughed softly and bit her again. Then he said, "Okay, we won't kiss." Cher breathed a sigh of relief. Then he sat by the side and picked up the ointment with one hand. Then he gently rubbed it on her back. His strength was just right. She let out a comfortable sigh. "Doesn't it hurt?" There was a hint of a smile in his voice. Cher made a sound of agreement. She was a little careless and relaxed. It was probably because it was too comfortable. Then, his palm began to apply force. She let out a cry and then bit her lip. "It hurts, it hurts, hurts." He laughed softly. "It doesn't hurt, okay? Bear with it." After saying that, his heart softened a little. He held her little hand with one hand and massaged it for her with the other. Her attention was focused on her little hands. He held her hand and gently rubbed it. It was a little warm, and he seemed to cherish it very much. She forgot about the pain and only felt that her little palms were sweaty. When she moved, he tightened his grip. She softly called out, "Big brother," and her little face finally moved out from the side of the pillow. Her hair was a little messy, and she was also a little sweaty. Her voice was a little seductive. She tilted her little face and looked at him with watery eyes. She looked so tender that it made people want to crush her in their arms. So he thought, and so he did. He held her head with one hand and kissed her gently, as if he was afraid of crushing her. His soft lips touched her rosy red lips very gently. His black eyes locked onto her little face, not letting go of any expression on her face. Cher was trembling. She stared at him with her eyes wide open and her body stiff. She wanted to push him away, but she didn't dare to. Apart from not daring to, she was also a little aroused. As though she was bewitched, she accepted his kiss. Her small and soft lips moved slightly in response. Chapter 2297. She was scared out of her wits. Her little hands clutched the collar of his gray shirt, looking as weak as a little beast. Too many emotions had accumulated, and he did not want to control himself anymore. At this moment, she was in his arms, on his bed. And she was his woman. She had always been his woman. His face was a little distorted, and she could not see it with her eyes closed. If she had opened her eyes, she would have been frightened by the look in his eyes. That kiss kept burning, burning until their bodies intertwined, and she was so engrossed that she forgot about their relationship, and even forgot about Lan Yu who was in the hospital. Until her back touched the bed, she cried out in pain and sobered up instantly. She gasped for breath and stared at him with her watery eyes. He was no better than her. His eyes were filled with the look of desire that he could not hide. He looked back into her eyes and raised his hand slowly to pinch her little chin. "Are you regretting it, huh?" Cher turned her face to the side and said stubbornly with a little anger and backbone, "I'll leave tomorrow." After saying that, she felt a little lost. Where should she go? Pei Yuan. Dad and Mom were strangers. Although this brother was bad, at least he was gentle to her, except for the fact that he liked to take advantage of her. She did not deny that she liked it when he kissed her. If he said that they had sex again, she would believe him. It was just a kiss, and they were so compatible. He knew how to please her, and she also knew how to respond to make him more excited. They must have kissed many times and even slept together. Such a discovery was shameful. At this moment, he was still very close to her, so close that she could feel the changes in him. She wanted to distance herself from him, so she shifted her body. Her back hurt again, and she cried. She laid on her side and cried without caring about him. She cried shamelessly because she was sure that he would not do anything to her. Or perhaps, she knew from the bottom of her heart that he would feel sorry for her. She used this feeling to tease him but did not give it to him. Actually, she knew that she was the selfish and hateful one. Indeed, his heart was about to melt when he saw her cry. He did not have the slightest desire for her anymore. He laid her down carefully and coaxed her in a low voice, saying all kinds of shameless things. Little Shui was struggling internally. Should she go or not? She could not decide. Yi Muyun said in a low voice, "It's my fault. I'm fascinated by lust." Cher's little face was still buried. He gently pulled it and placed it on his shoulder. He said in a low voice, "Okay, good girl, don't cry. You apologize." That little person was still trying to be obedient after being taken advantage of. He kicked him with his little foot. Yi Muyun laughed hoarsely. "All right, I apologize. I shouldn't have kissed you. I shouldn't have kissed you so deeply. I shouldn't have touched you." Cher glared at him. How was this an apology? This was clearly teasing. Her expression was so adorable that Yi Muyun couldn't help but lean forward and rub the tip of his nose against hers. "Cher, do you dare to say that you didn't enjoy it? How dare you say you don't like kissing me? I don't like it." She covered her ears, refusing to listen to his shameless words. Her little body curled up into a small ball on his dark gray bed sheets. Especially since she was not wearing shoes and her small feet were on his knees, the contrast between white and black was very strong. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and his voice became even milder. "You really don't like it?" Chapter 2298. Cher suddenly hugged him. Her slender arms hugged his neck tightly. Her arms were slightly cold, but his neck was warm. She hugged him so tightly that he almost couldn't breathe. But he didn't say anything and just let her hug him. It had been so many years since he had taken the initiative to be so intimate. There were even tears in his eyes. That was something she couldn't understand because she had lost her memory. Or perhaps she couldn't understand before she lost her memory. What's wrong? Why are you acting like a child all of a sudden? His voice was gentle but deep. There was also a hint of affection in it. Cher tightened her arms and felt that her throat was blocked. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "Brother, just be my brother, okay? Don't be too good. Just be like that." She buried her face. "I'm afraid." As for what she was afraid of, she couldn't explain it. She was afraid, but she wanted to hug him tightly. She was afraid. With him by her side, she didn't seem to be afraid anymore. "All right, be good." He hugged her and comforted her softly. He knew that he had scared her just now. In her memory, she was Lan Yu's wife and he was just her brother. "Promise me that what happened tonight won't happen again." She buried her face in his chest and tightened her grip. Her heart ached when she said that. There seemed to be such a scene in her memory, but she couldn't remember it. Her head hurt, and the pain was getting worse. Her face was pale as she snuggled in his arms. Her back didn't hurt that much. Maybe she stayed in his bedroom because she wanted to be close to him. She despised herself. Just because he said that they had sex, she couldn't control herself. He was like a poison that attracted her. She moved closer to him shyly. Her face was getting paler and paler. She couldn't forgive herself. "It hurts. My head hurts." She raised her head, and her small hand pierced through his shirt and dug into his arm. Beads of sweat rolled down her forehead, and other than the pain in her eyes, there was a trace of clarity. He would never forget that look in her eyes. It was that night, the night she decided to leave him. The last look she had when she looked at him. "Cher." His voice was sorrowful as he hugged her body, hoping for her to respond. But she only gave him a dazed smile and slowly closed her eyes. She fainted. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and hugged her tightly. He took out his phone from his pocket and dialed the number of Xingyuan Hospital's director. He asked him to send a neurologist to the hospital while he carried Shui downstairs. When he reached downstairs, he ordered the servants to take good care of Ishu before he left in a hurry. On the second floor, Xiao Ishu secretly lay on the terrace and watched Uncle Yi take his mother away. There is a touch of confusion on his little face. Does Uncle Yi like his mother? Also, can an older brother kiss his younger sister? Papa had said that this kind of person was called a pervert. Then Uncle Yi is a pervert. Xiao Ishu's little face was filled with disappointment because he could tell that his mother seemed to like that pervert quite a bit. On the other side, Yi Muyun brought the patient to Xingyuan Hospital and found the best expert to do an electroencephalogram. The results showed that there was no problem. Chapter 2299. The director of Xingyuan Hospital rushed over and patted Yi Muyun's shoulder like an elder. "Take it easy. You can't be too hasty. Maybe she will recover one day." Yi Muyun forced a smile. "I hope so." The director frowned. "Did you two quarrel before Miss Tang fainted, or did you try to jog her memory, Mr. Yi?" Yi Muyun was put in a difficult position by the director's question. His handsome face blushed a little. The director was also a little nosy, so he pricked up his ears to listen. For the sake of Cher's health, Mr. Yi told the truth. "I kissed her." "Kissed her?" The director and the director looked at each other. Wasn't Mr. Yi a little too hasty? In Miss Tang's memory, Lan Yu was her real husband. But now, he was in a vegetative state, lying in the hospital, half dead. Mr. Yi, on the other hand, had brought her back and kissed her that night. However, the director and the director did not dare to criticize the private affairs of the Tang family unless they had lost their job. Especially the director. He laughed dryly. "Congratulations, Mr. Yi." Mr. Yi did not appreciate it and said coldly, "What's there to congratulate? She had fainted after a kiss. If he had really done something to her, wouldn't she be able to get over it?" The director felt uncomfortable and coughed. "I'm improving bit by bit." Actually, he could tell that it did not matter whether Miss Tang woke up or not. What mattered was whether she could accept Mr. Yi and be with Mr. Yi. So, the director looked around. The young nurses around them and the chief surgeon had all left, leaving only him and Yi Muyun. "Mr. Yi, I know it's not easy for you." You have to take care of such a big corporation and you have to take care of Miss Tang and your child. You can't relax, can you? Yi Muyun's handsome face turned cold. Are you going to introduce a woman to me? The dean smiled and said hurriedly, how can that be? I wouldn't dare even if I had 10 guts. Moreover, which woman in the past could be worthy of Mr. Yi? In the end, the president added, except for Miss Tang. Others might not dare to say it, but the director was well aware of Boyi's situation, including Mr. Ye's feelings. Boyi was now mostly in the hands of Mr. Yi, and Miss Tang belonged to Mr. Yi. As long as Mr. Yi didn't let go, Miss Tang would belong to Mr. Yi. Only by pleasing Mr. Yi would she be rewarded. It could only be Miss Tang who would give a woman to Mr. Yi. Now, Mr. Yi was in a dilemma. If he could make a contribution and stand on the right side, he would be able to secure his position as the director of Xingyuan Hospital. As the director said so, Yi Muyun snorted coldly, but he did not leave immediately. The director gathered his courage and said, our hospital has a batch of new drugs. They are very useful for treating that thing. If Mr. Yi wants them, I have 2 bottles in my office. Yi Muyun frowned and looked at the director. The director's heart was trembling, but he still said bravely, I promise there are no side effects. My wife has been taking it too. Our married life is quite harmonious. After saying that, Yi Muyun's eyes turned cold. The director cursed in his heart. His flattery had gone awry. To his surprise, Mr. Yi said calmly in a restrained and arrogant tone, let me see. Chapter 2300. The director immediately ran over to give out his private medicine and put it on the table. Yi Muyun looked at the ingredients and found that it was Chinese medicine. He opened it and smelled it. It smelled sweet. Why don't I change the packaging for Mr. Yi? The director said considerately. Mr. Yi did not object. After the director changed the packaging, he asked in a low voice, you didn't put this medicine in the office for your wife, did you? The director wiped his sweat and said awkwardly, Mr. Yi, my wife is the head nurse here. Sometimes her working hours are opposite to mine. Some things can only be solved in the office. Yi Muyun got up and glared at him. The director, who was in his 50s, did not know how he had offended Mr. Yi. It was clear that Mr. Yi had good intentions. Although he felt uneasy, he felt relieved when he thought that Mr. Yi always took the medicine away. Because Cher was not seriously injured, he took her home that night. The car drove slowly for an hour. When they returned to the villa, it was almost 1 o'clock. She had a slight injury on her back. He carried her upstairs. After thinking about it, he carried her into his bedroom so that he could take care of her at night. The light in the bedroom was dim. He put her on the soft bed, changed her pajamas, and lay on her side. He knelt down beside her and gently touched her little face with his fingers. After looking at her for a long time, he went to the bathroom to take a shower. He wanted to sleep with her, but after thinking about it, he slept on the sofa. The light dimmed. He could see her little face after lying down. Yi Muyun held a small medicine bottle between his fingers. His eyes were deep and he was struggling. He wanted her, but he did not want to force her. What was the point of that? In the middle of the night, a little man came in from the door. He saw his mother first, and his mouth opened wide as if he was shocked. Then he saw Yi Sanson sleeping on the sofa. The little man was relieved. The little boy stared at Yi Sanson for a long time. Suddenly, he climbed onto the bed and hugged his mother with his fat body. He wanted to protect his mother. Cher did not wake up, but Yi Muyun watched the little fellow's clumsy performance and felt like laughing. The sadness in his heart had also been diluted a little. No matter what, they were now by his side, Cher and their child. Under the dim light, he watched his woman and his child finally fall asleep at the break of dawn. When he woke up, there was a little thing in his arms. When he opened his eyes, it was actually that fat little thing. It was obvious that the little thing hadn't woken up yet. It was sleeping in a daze, looking very cute. His hair was very similar to Cher's when she was young. His forehead was slightly curly, and he smelled like milk buns. He missed this smell, so he held the little fellow in his arms and took a deep breath. It smelled really good. The little guy opened one of his eyes and looked at Yi Muyun. His eyelids drooped again. She hugged his neck with her chubby little hands and called out softly, "San San. San San." Yi Muyun thought he had heard wrongly and frowned. "Ishu. San San." The little fellow buried himself in his arms, and his little feet sneakily reached into his arms to keep warm. "Uncle will be called Yi Sansan from now on." Yi Muyun did not know whether to laugh or cry. Even if it was 3, it was Lan Yu. He was the original wife. The authentic one. Chapter 2301. He wasn't angry because Lan Yu was now in a vegetative state. He wouldn't be able to snatch his wife from him. Mr. Yi said generously, "Then, from now on, I'll be called Ishu Lan Air. What do you think?" Xiao Ishu grew up in New York. She could speak Mandarin, but she wasn't proficient in it. She didn't know much about it, especially when it came to its deep meaning. In a daze, he raised his head and looked at Yi Sansan. "Lan Air?" "Yes. Think about it. Isn't 2 older than 3? Mr. Yi patiently guided her. She dared to call him 3. This idiot. Xiao Ishu scratched her head. He was right. 2 was older than 3, so it was in front. After thinking about it, Xiao Ishu agreed. However, she still looked reluctant. "Then, I'll be older than you from now on." "Yes. Then, I'll call you 2. Mr. Yi smiled meaningfully. Xiao Ishu looked at him. "I'll call you 3. Of course. 2 and 3. It was settled. What about Mommy? Lan Air didn't forget about his dear mother. Mr. Yi thought about it carefully and decided. Your mother will be called Little 69. She likes this number the most. Why 2? Lan Air asked. As for this kind of adult question, Mr. Yi naturally wouldn't explain it clearly to him. He coughed. Because your mother is a woman. All women like 69. Lan Air clapped his hands. Then, when Mommy wakes up, I'll tell her. Mr. Yi sneered. Tell her then. You want to protect your mother with this IQ. Lan Air looked at Yi Sansan. He felt like he had been tricked. Alright, Yishu, your intuition was right. Yi Muyun looked at Cher. She was still asleep and didn't look like she was going to wake up anytime soon. He got up and picked up Xiao Lan Air with one hand. Uncle will take you to brush your teeth and wash your face. Little Lan Air's face was red. Uncle, I can wash it myself. Yi Muyun looked at him and smiled. Alright. How obedient. He rubbed the little guy and watched him run away. At this time, Little Blue Second didn't want to protect his mommy anymore. Yi Muyun looked at the little fellow running away and smiled. He also went to wash his face. When he came out, Cher still showed no signs of waking up. In his heart, he thought that he had pushed her too hard. He had always wanted to recover their previous memories, and a certain nerve in her had been touched. But she didn't seem to want to wake up. Was it because of that painful memory that she didn't want to wake up? Or did she not want to remember the past from the bottom of her heart? This thought made him uncomfortable. After looking at her for a long time, he finally lowered his head and kissed her lightly on the lips. He felt very conflicted. He hoped that she would remember, but at the same time, he was afraid that she would remember. 10 minutes later, he stood on the balcony and finished smoking a cigarette before going downstairs. Xiao Yishu was already sitting at the dining table. This little fellow was very observant. His father was lying in the hospital, and his mother was lying on Yi Sansan's bed. Who could he rely on? Only Yi Sansan. Although the little fellow had given in, he was still filled with grief and indignation. He looked at Yi Muyun anxiously and ate his breakfast unwillingly. Your mother wasn't feeling well last night. Uncle was just taking care of her. Yi Muyun rubbed his little head and said gently. Xiao Yishu let out a long "oh," obviously not believing him. Chapter 2302. Yi Muyun smiled and replied, of course. Xiao Yishu jumped off the chair and climbed onto his lap. Yishu likes uncle very much too, she said in a soft voice. Yi Muyun's heart softened when the little fellow added, then, can I sleep with uncle in the future? Mr. Yi looked at Xiao Yishu and rejected it in his heart. Was this his biological son? He was very doubtful. He did not say anything for a long time. Xiao Yishu said, uncle is lying. Uncle only likes mummy. Then, Xiao Yishu began to cry. His voice was so loud that it shook the heavens. That posture was comparable to Cher's in the past. But Xiao Yishu was a boy. When he cried, it did not seem out of place. He just cried like that. The little fellow peeked at Yi Sansan and did not come over to coax him, so he cried even harder. Wah wah, Yi Sansan is so bad. Yi Muyun's heart softened when he saw the little fellow crying. It was a sour and sweet feeling that he could not describe. This was his child, a child born by him and Cher. He was cute and looked very much like his own child. In his heart, he hoped that the child was a girl. With Xiao Yishu's temperament, if it was a girl, it would be so soft and adorable. Taking a closer look, the little fellow was chubby and looked very delicate. He looked very much like Cher when she was young. Yi Muyun's heart softened even more. He reached out to touch the little fellow and smiled. Of course, I like Yishu too. But how could this kind of love be the same? Mr. Yi thought to himself. Xiao Yishu did not care and continued to cry. In the end, Yi Muyun reached out to hug him and coax him for a long time. Water doll. He thought to himself, what should I do when a boy loves to cry so much? It was distressing and sweet at the same time. The morning passed just like that. Xiao Yishu tossed and turned for a while and was tired. She fell asleep while playing. Then, her little chin tilted and she drooled as she fell asleep, lying in Yi Muyun's arms. He looked at the delicate little face in the crook of his arm and felt like a loving father. He lowered his head and kissed the little fellow. Once, twice, it was never enough. He carried the little fellow to his bedroom and looked at her for a long time. The more he looked, the more perverted he felt. He wanted to have a child like Xiao Yishu, but a girl. Raising a child like Xiaoxin from a young age should be a very fulfilling thing. Yi Muyun smiled. When he returned to his bedroom, he found that Cher was already awake, leaning against the headboard in a daze. He stood by the door and closed it behind him. That soft sound startled her, and she looked up at him. It's almost noon. Are you hungry? His voice was gentle. This is my bedroom. It's convenient for me to take care of you since you fainted last night. She grunted and scratched her hair. Where's Yishu? Yi Muyun said calmly, she's tired and sleeping in the bedroom. Cher grunted again and looked at him. My pajamas, I changed them. he said simply and crudely. Then, the two of them fell into a long silence. Cher looked up and bit her lips. Then you go out first. I want to change my clothes. Yi Muyun smiled. Go to the changing room. Your clothes are in there. She was stunned for a moment, but then she went. When she opened his wardrobe, she was completely stunned. Other than his own clothes, half of them were for girls. Chapter 2303. Your figure hasn't changed much. You should still be able to wear your old clothes. He leaned against the door of the changing room and said calmly. Cher was still in a daze. She didn't understand. Her clothes were clearly here, but he had prepared a lot of clothes in the bedroom. It's been 8 years. These clothes might not be suitable for you. He smiled. Or do you still like these pink clothes? Of course not. Cher shook her head subconsciously. She picked a set of slightly more mature clothes and looked sideways at him. Yi Muyun smiled faintly, but she still retreated. The door closed. She changed into the clothes as fast as she could. They fit her well. Cher looked at herself in the mirror. The sunlight shone on the mirror and there was a layer of light. Standing in front of the mirror, she seemed to see herself in the distance. Brother, be careful not to get eaten up. Wow, the way her brother looked at her was so scary. She seemed to see a small version of herself, but it was only for a moment. The light brought her back to reality. Standing in front of the mirror was her 26-year-old self. The 26-year-old Tang Cher. She still couldn't remember the past, but she was sure that Yi Muyun was her brother in the past. That memory was so deep that it couldn't be erased. Her head hurt again. She didn't dare to think about it anymore. She rubbed her forehead and walked out. Yi Muyun stood at the door and looked at her calmly. Then he smiled. It's the same as before. Cher pursed her lips, feeling a little uncomfortable. After a while, she bit her lip. I want to see Yishu first. You don't have to ask me these questions. He was very gentle. This is your house, remember? Snow stared at him for a long time before replying, oh. Yi Muyun held her hand. But let's eat first. It's almost noon. Cher's hands were sweaty. Her heart was beating fast as he held her hand and they walked downstairs. She retracted her hand. I'll walk by myself. As an older brother, how could he hold his little sister's hand so easily? Yi Muyun's hand tightened, but he didn't let go of her. He said faintly, low blood sugar. What if you faint again? She bit her lips and didn't say anything. She thought a meal was waiting for her, but it wasn't there. She sat in front of the dining table, resting her chin on her hand. Where's the food? I'll do it. His voice was soft and light. Then, he stood in front of the kitchen counter and skillfully began to cook. Cher's eyes widened. Looking at him in the apron, she still couldn't accept it. This was very strange. Have I ever cooked for you before? She asked softly. Yi Muyun's movements were a little slow, and it took a long time for him to reply, no. I used to be very busy. She was so busy that she had no time to fall in love. She was so busy that she was afraid of him. Oh, Cher replied, still looking at his back. He was very good looking. Even though he was wearing an apron, his figure was still excellent. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. She just looked at him like that. He didn't say anything either. In the open kitchen that was filled with sunlight, there was only the sound of him chopping vegetables. As the sunlight shone in, Cher suddenly felt a sense of beauty. This beauty diluted the sadness of losing Lanyu, and also soothed the uneasiness in her heart. Chapter 23:04. He held his breath and turned to look at her. She smiled sweetly at him, just like when she was young. His heart softened, and he stroked her long hair with one hand. Okay. But a man's words, except in bed, could not be listened to in the kitchen. But Cher took it seriously. She really regarded him as a family member, because she could feel that he was good to her. Brother. She called out again, probably because she was touched. Yi Muyun smiled and pulled her little body in front of him. Brother will teach you how to cook. Cher was dumbfounded. She was just touched. The most important thing was to find someone to feed her. She had no intention of learning how to cook. And what would Xiao Yishu think if she saw her half in his arms? Although she was not Xiao Yishu's biological mother, Yishu did not know. So she pulled a long face and looked bitter. Yi Muyun chuckled and put his chin on her hair deliberately. You called me brother just now, but now you think I'm a pervert, huh? He was determined to take advantage of her. She should be afraid of him. No. The little guy in his arms said with a grievance. She was not interested in it at all, so she put her chin on his arm and looked at him eagerly. He made her a bowl of winterine skill with rice noodles. She was reluctant at first, but when she smelled the sweet and sour taste, her appetite was aroused. After a while, she asked him, "Is it done?" Yi Muyun looked down at her with a smile in his eyes. It should be done soon. Oh, Cher did not say anything else. She stared at the pot of soup, drooling. After he filled a big bowl, she asked him, "When did you learn how to cook?" "The 8 years you were not here." His voice was indifferent. Then, Cher had an indescribable feeling. It was another 8 years. What had happened between them 8 years ago? She wanted to know, but she did not dare to know. She could only purse her lips and look at him timidly. Yi Muyun smiled and took it for her. Then, he held her little hand and said gently, "Hurry up and eat." The food he made was quite authentic. It was sweet and sour, and very appetizing. Yi Muyun watched as she buried her head in her food and reached out to stroke her long hair. "You used to love old Chen's cooking." Cher looked up at him. "Old Chen." "In Pei Garden's kitchen," Yi Muyun said calmly. 2 years after you left, old Chen returned to his hometown. "Oh, so you learned this, big brother. Did you learn it from him?" She cautiously kept to a safe topic. Yi Muyun's expression froze, then he slowly said, "No, he's not here anymore." Cher was stunned. She stared blankly at his handsome face and murmured, "Why isn't he here?" "He's sick." He sighed. "Cher, you've forgotten about me. If I were to get sick during these 8 years," before he could finish his sentence, she covered his lips. "I won't." She said it quickly and anxiously. There were tears in her eyes as well. That pitiful look of hers made one feel both amused and annoyed at the same time. Most of all, it made one's heart ache for her. Yi Muyun's gaze deepened as he cursed in his heart. This idiot. Reaching out, he touched her long hair gently with his fingers and said in a low voice, "People will always get sick. I won't allow you to get sick." She blurted out naturally. Chapter 23:05. For a long time, she was still looking at him in a daze. So he wasn't absent from her memories. She instinctively refused to let anything happen to him. Or rather, she had always loved him. It had never changed, whether she could remember him or not. "All right," he said in a low voice. Then, he smiled and said, "Shwa, I will always be with you." There were still tears in her eyes. She looked at this man, who was actually a stranger, and her heart was palpitating. She could guess that he had been an important man in her life. Perhaps what he said was true. They had been together and even had sex. How did we break up? She said softly. Why did I leave 8 years ago? Yi Muyun stroked her long hair. Cher, we didn't break up. Didn't break up? She looked at him, wanting to ask more, but she didn't have the courage to. And he just smiled gently. After a long time, she took a sip of soup and looked down. I want to visit Lan Yu in the hospital this afternoon. That man was very vague in her memories, but she remembered that she had lived with him for several years and that he had become like that because he had saved her. At this moment, in Cher's heart, Lan Yu was more important than Yi Muyun. One was like the clouds in the sky, and the other was like a vague fog. She couldn't figure it out, nor did she dare to figure it out. After she said that, Yi Muyun pursed his lips and said in a low voice, "All right, I'll take you there." She widened her eyes slightly, seemingly surprised. What's wrong? Yi Muyun chuckled. Are you stunned? No. She shook her head. He smiled gently. Oh yes, after visiting Lan Yu, we'll take Xiao Yishu to the kindergarten. If Yishu likes it, she can study there next year. So soon. Cher looked at him and hesitated. If Lan Yu wakes up, his eyes were deep, but his expression didn't change. There's no if. You can transfer schools. I know you want to go back to New York. Cher felt apologetic, but that was the truth. She sensed danger, she was so afraid of him, but she couldn't resist his approach. Seeing how straightforward he was, she faintly felt a sense of loss from the bottom of her heart. This kind of loss was quite shameful. She lowered her head, feeling a little down. No matter what, thank you. Actually, she knew that it was unfair for her to cling on to him even though they had a past. She said that she was with Lan Yu and that she coveted Yi Muyun's care. Her little face was a little hot. She felt that she was bad. Yi Muyun looked at her quietly. After a long time, he smiled. You call me brother. It's my duty to take care of you. He paused for a moment before saying, when you get used to it, I'll move out. Cher looked up in surprise. I should have my own life. For example, looking for a girlfriend, he said indifferently. Her heart ached. He wanted to look for a girlfriend. Then why did he hug her earlier on? Kiss her. She was completely stunned and couldn't come back to her senses for a long time. The disappointment on her little face wasn't hidden at all. It was pure and clean like a piece of white paper. Chapter 2306. She forgot the past and only remembered that Lan Yu was not someone she could choose. She was already lucky to be alive. What more could she ask for? Suddenly, he reached out and hugged her. He pressed her against his chest and said in a low voice, let's just live like this, okay? Cher stared at him blankly, as if she had forgotten to speak, and just stared at him. After a long time, she shook her head and said, let's not. What if Lan Yu wakes up? It sounded a little sinful. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and didn't say anything. He just smiled. No matter what, in her heart, Lan Yu was not that important. At least, she did not want Lan Yu to wake up. Their eyes met and the atmosphere was a little strange. At this moment, Xiao Yishu woke up. It was too quiet, so she ran down and called her mother in a daze. Cher looked over and reached out to Xiao Yishu. Xiao Yishu screamed and ran into her mother's arms. She hugged her mother tightly and acted like a spoiled child. Mommy. The little fellow's little face was tilted as he looked at Yi Muyun. There was a guarded look in his eyes. Yi Muyun did not know whether to laugh or cry. He really wanted to do something, but what could he do in broad daylight? He walked over and reached out to rub the little guy's short hair. He said with a smile, "Uncle will cook for you, okay?" There was still wariness in the little guy's eyes. He looked at him eagerly. Yi Muyun smiled again and did not argue with him. He walked to the counter and said, "How about a seafood mushroom rice?" Xiao Yishu was a foodie. When she heard that, she almost drooled. But she still pretended to be very calm. "Uncle Yi, how did you do?" Yi Muyun turned around and leaned against the counter, but her gaze fell deeply on Shue's face. She laughed softly and said, "You can ask Mama if I did well." How could Xiao Yishu understand an adult's conversation? "Mommy, did Uncle do a good job?" he asked Shue. Cher looked at Yi Muyun. He smiled and said, "I mean the rice." Her little face blushed red, and then she said randomly, "It's all right." Xiao Yishu was satisfied. She climbed onto the chair and waited for the rice. Cher's face was extremely red. She said, "I'll go upstairs to rest for a while." She ran away as if she was escaping. Yi Muyun looked at her back and smiled. What a coward. Cher ran all the way up the stairs, her heart still pounding. She thought that she must have gone mad. To think that she was actually imagining whether or not he had done a good job. She ran into the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm herself down. She raised her eyes and looked at her little face in the mirror. It was unbelievably red. She hurriedly splashed water on her face. She must be crazy. Downstairs, Yi Muyun was making the mushroom rice for the little guy. Occasionally, he would look at the stairs in the hall. The little guy had not come down for a long time. Maybe it was shy. He smiled and continued to cut the mushrooms. As he was cutting, he couldn't help but look at it again. A little guy ran over and stood by the side. "Uncle, look at the mushroom. Did you think of something?" "Think of what?" Yi Muyun found it funny. What did a little kid know? Chapter 2307. Yi Muyun lowered his head and looked at himself. Little mushroom. He looked like him. He then glanced at Xiao Yishu. "You look like yourself, don't you?" Little Yishu's face suddenly turned red, and then she ran back to him. Yi Muyun chuckled. "We're both boys. Are you shy?" Xiao Yishu's face tensed up and he did not say anything else. Yi Muyun did not think much of it and thought that the little boy was embarrassed. He smiled and quickly prepared the mushroom rice for him. While the little boy was eating, he said secretly, "I don't have a little mushroom." Yi Muyun was not at ease. He rubbed his little head and comforted him. "Yishu has grown up. You'll be just like Uncle." Xiao Yishu looked at him again, looking a little embarrassed. However, he did not say anything and buried his head in his food. Yi Muyun's cooking was pretty good. Xiao Yishu enjoyed the food and accepted that Yi Sansan would take care of him and his mother for the time being. In view of Yi Sansan's culinary skills, he allowed him to take care of them. However, he did not expect the little boy to be allergic to seafood. It was something he had never experienced before. He had just finished eating and there were rashes on his neck. It looked really scary. "Uncle, it's ticklish." Xiao Yishu bit his lips and looked pitiful. Yi Muyun was shocked. He reached out to stop the little boy from scratching and immediately carried him to the living room. He changed his shoes and took his coat. He walked to the parking lot and opened the car door. He then dialed Cher's number. "Come down immediately. Yishu has an allergy." He spoke very quickly, without any superfluous words, but calmly and steadily. Xiao Yishu was in so much pain that he wanted to scratch with his little hands. Yi Muyun carried him and stroked his hair. It won't look good if you scratch it. Xiao Yishu's face was wrinkled as if he was in pain. After a while, he finally cried. Uncle, will I die? You will. He looked at him and pinched his nose. What are you thinking about? You'll be fine after taking some medicine. At this moment, Cher had already run down. She was even wearing slippers. She quickly opened the car door and got into the car. Yi Muyun turned to look at her little feet and silently handed the little boy over. He buckled his seatbelt and started the car. He did not speak, but the car was very fast. They arrived at Xingyuan Hospital in about 20 minutes. Cher had just opened the car door when Yi Muyun came over. She carried the little fellow with one hand and walked toward the hospital lobby. As she walked, she dialed the hospital director's number. Get the chief of internal medicine to prepare immediately. The chief asked. Why did Mr. Yi bring Miss Tang to the internal medicine department again? However, he did not dare to say it out loud. He personally picked Miss Tang and went to the internal medicine department. When he arrived, he found out that it was a misunderstanding. It turned out that Miss Tang's son was allergic to seafood. The chief heaved a sigh of relief. However, he also felt that Mr. Yi was making a fuss. It was just an allergy. Besides, he was someone else's son. He was so nervous as if he was his own son. After the examination, Xiao Yishu needed an allergy injection. The usually cheerful and lively child was actually so afraid of injections. He hid in Cher's arms and meowed like a pitiful kitten. Yi Muyun's heart softened and his voice softened. Why is he so timid? And he's a boy. Chapter 2308. But after a while, when the nurse came over with the syringe, he started wailing again. He buried his face in Cher's arms and said, Mommy, I don't want an injection. Cher couldn't coax him. He was too stubborn. In the end, Yi Muyun hugged him and stroked his short fur. He kissed his forehead and said, just a little, just like a mosquito bite. Xiao Yishu lay in his arms. She looked up and asked tearfully, Really? Yi Muyun smiled and said, Of course. He looked at the nurse and gestured for her to give him the injection. The young nurse smiled and carefully pricked the needle on the soft and tender skin. Although it was very soft, the little person howled like a pig being slaughtered, ow 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 ow. Snow felt quite humiliated by this. Yi Muyun was stunned. He held the little person and comforted him, It doesn't hurt anymore. It'll be fine after a while. Xiao Yishu's eyes were filled with tears. Really? Does it still hurt now? Yi Muyun's voice was very gentle. The nurse had finished the injection. She got up but still rubbed the little guy. He was too cute. Xiao Yishu was still lying on the bed. She bit her lips and her tears fell. It still hurts. Then the little guy looked at Yi Muyun and said, Daddy used to kiss me when I got an injection. Kiss? Kiss where? Kiss his dick. Yi Muyun was in a difficult position. But in his heart, he wanted to compete with Lan Yu. In the end, he held it in and kissed him. Daddy used to give me a big kiss, Shu whimpered as she lay on her stomach. Mr. Yi rejected it. What kind of perverted hobby did Lan Yu have? But since it was like this, he had to kiss him. So he endured it and kissed her twice forcefully. After kissing her, he felt that his whole body was not well. Cher watched from the side and swallowed her saliva. He could really kiss her. Yi Muyun looked up at her and said, Why don't you kiss me too? Cher refused without thinking, I don't have this hobby. As soon as she finished speaking, she regretted saying what was in her heart. Yi Muyun glared at her. She stuck out her tongue and lowered her head. He looked at her and then at the little one on his knees. His head was throbbing. Xiao Yishu lay on her stomach, her voice weak. Does uncle not like Xiao Yishu? His kisses are insincere. Did he really have to look at his sincerity to take advantage of a prostitute? Mr. Yi endured it and quickly pressed on the left and right, making a loud smacking sound. This was considered sincerity, right? Xiao Yishu was finally satisfied and believed in his subject's love for him. She lay on her stomach shyly and said, "Well, I usually only let Papa kiss me." Yi Muyun really doubted how he could give birth to such a perverted child. As expected, following Lan Yu was like Lan Yu. Mr. Yi was the scapegoat. Kissing Papa, right? Mr. Yi held the little fellow and kissed him fiercely. Xiao Yishu cried out, "Uncle, you're so perverted." Mr. Yi was stunned. How did he become a pervert? It was Lan Error who asked him to kiss him. This was definitely not his biological child. It must be a spy sent by Lan Yu. Mr. Yi was in a terrible mood. He held the little fellow and tidied his clothes. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.